Sarah let herself appear to struggle with the question, as if Warren's probing was uncovering genuine doubts about her loyalties. Sometimes I wonder if they really understand what's at stake, if they're more concerned with bureaucratic protocols than with actually protecting people. It was exactly the kind of response that would interest a foreign intelligence handler, signs of disillusionment that could be exploited for recruitment purposes. Warren's pen moved across her notepad with increased speed, documenting what she believed was Sarah's growing psychological vulnerability. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. That's a natural response to operational stress, Warren said carefully. Many soldiers struggle with the disconnect between field realities and command decisions. Have you considered that your superiors might have access to information that changes the tactical picture? Of course. But from where I was sitting, watching people die who could have been saved. Sarah let her voice trail off, projecting the kind of moral uncertainty that recruitment specialists look for in potential assets. It makes you wonder whose interests are really being served. The session continued for another 40 minutes, with Warren probing deeper into Sarah's supposed psychological state while Sarah carefully fed her intelligence designed to suggest exploitable vulnerabilities. It was psychological warfare conducted in comfortable chairs over cups of coffee, and Sarah found herself both impressed by Warren's skill and horrified by her own growing proficiency at the same techniques. Over the following weeks, Sarah developed a routine that felt like living multiple lives simultaneously. During the day, she continued her advanced training with the other operators, learning skills that pushed the boundaries of what she'd thought possible. But her evenings were spent in careful preparation for sessions with Warren, crafting fictional psychological states that would draw the spy deeper into revealing her own methods and priorities. The breakthrough came during their 7th session, when Warren made a mistake that revealed the true scope of her operation. Sarah had been describing a fictional crisis of conscience about American foreign policy, painting herself as increasingly disillusioned with her country's international activities. Warren, perhaps sensing an opportunity for recruitment, began asking questions that demonstrated knowledge of classified operations that weren't part of Sarah's psychological profile. Your concerns about civilian casualties are understandable, Warren said, especially given recent operations in Southeast Asia that haven't been reported in conventional media. Sarah felt her pulse quicken while maintaining her facade of moral uncertainty. Warren was referencing operations that existed only in the highest classification levels, information that no military psychologist should have possessed unless she was receiving it through intelligence channels that bypassed normal security protocols. I wasn't aware that those operations were common knowledge, Sarah replied carefully. They're not, Warren said, and Sarah realized the spy had made a critical error in judgment. But in my position, I sometimes receive briefings about activities that might affect the psychological well-being of personnel under my evaluation. It was a plausible cover story, but Sarah's training had taught her to recognize deception even when it was skillfully presented. Warren's explanation didn't account for the specific details she'd referenced, intelligence that would only be available to someone with direct access to operational planning documents or foreign intelligence sources. That night, Sarah encrypted a detailed report about Warren's slip and transmitted it through communication channels that she still didn't fully understand. The response came within hours, delivered through the same anonymous courier system that had brought her father's classified file months earlier. New instructions, new objectives, and a timeline that suggested events were moving toward a conclusion that would test everything she'd learned about moral flexibility and operational necessity. The final phase of the operation required Sarah to accelerate her apparent psychological deterioration, creating a crisis that would force Warren to reveal her true identity and operational methods. Working with experts in psychological manipulation who made her own training seem elementary, Sarah constructed a fictional breakdown that would appear genuine to even the most skilled intelligence professional. "I can't sleep," she told Warren during what both of them knew would be their last session, though only Sarah understood why. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the faces of people I could have saved if my orders had been different." Warren leaned forward with an expression of professional concern that Sarah now recognized as calculated manipulation. "These feelings are more common than you might think. Many people in your position struggle with the disconnect between their personal ethics and their professional obligations. It's more than that," Sarah continued, letting genuine emotion color her fabricated confession. "I'm starting to think that maybe we're not the good guys. Maybe the people we're fighting against have legitimate grievances that we're ignoring because it's convenient." This was the moment that months of careful preparation had been building toward. Warren's response would either confirm that she was indeed a foreign intelligence operative attempting to recruit Sarah, or prove that she was simply a skilled military psychologist trying to help a troubled soldier. Warren set down her pen and looked directly at Sarah with an expression that contained no trace of professional detachment. "What if I told you that there were other people who shared your concerns? People who believed that American foreign policy had lost its moral foundation and needed to be corrected from within?" The words hung in the air between them like a confession and an invitation. Sarah had her confirmation, but she also had a choice to make about how to respond. Her training provided clear protocols for this situation, but implementing those protocols would mean crossing lines that she'd never imagined having to cross. "I'd say that I'd like to meet those people," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the knowledge that she was committing herself to a course of action that would end with someone dying. Warren smiled, and for the first time since Sarah had known her, the expression seemed completely genuine. "I think that can be arranged." The meeting Warren arranged took place in a location that felt designed to test Sarah's commitment to her undercover roll-up private residence in suburban Virginia, where she found herself face-to-face with three people who represented different aspects of the intelligence network her father had died trying to expose. There was Hansen, a current CIA analyst who'd been feeding information to foreign handlers for over a decade. Martinez, a Defense Department contractor with access to weapons development programs that officially didn't exist. And Petrov, not Anya from the arms-dealing operation, but her older brother, a former Russian intelligence officer who now coordinated espionage activities from within the United States. "Miss Chen," Petrov greeted her with accented English and the kind of smile that suggested he'd been expecting her arrival. "Katerina tells me you've been having some doubts about your country's activities abroad." Sarah nodded, maintaining the psychological profile she'd constructed while studying faces that would soon appear in intelligence reports that could prevent future attacks on American interests. "More than doubts. I'm starting to think that patriotism might require opposing some of the things we do in the name of national security." It was exactly what they wanted to hear, and for the next 3 hours Sarah listened to detailed discussions of ongoing espionage operations, planned intelligence transfers, and strategic objectives that would have made Colonel Stone's superiors declare war if they'd been conducted by a uniformed enemy. These weren't foreign spies operating against American interests. They were American citizens who'd chosen to betray their country for ideological reasons, financial compensation, or simple revenge against systems that had disappointed them. Revelation that disturbed Sarah most was learning the scope of the intelligence that had been compromised through Warren's psychological evaluation program. Nearly every special operations soldier who'd undergone psychological screening in the past 5 years had been assessed for potential recruitment, with detailed profiles passed to foreign intelligence services for use in targeting American personnel overseas. "Your father," Warren said as the evening was ending, "was identified through similar means. We knew about his investigation before he realized we knew, which allowed us to manage the situation appropriately. The casual reference to her father's murder, for that's what it had been, despite the official designation as a training accident, nearly broke Sarah's carefully maintained cover. Only years of training in emotional control kept her from reaching for the weapon she carried, or revealing that she knew exactly who these people really were. What happened to him? She asked instead, letting her voice carry the vulnerability that would be expected from someone learning about her father's fate. He had to be neutralized, Petrov replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine business operations. His investigation was approaching levels that would have compromised operational security. The training accident was ... convenient. Sarah memorized every word, every expression, every detail that would appear in her final report about the network her father had died trying to expose. But she also found herself thinking about Dr. Warren's psychological evaluation months earlier, about the question of whether she could maintain her ethical framework while developing the capacity for moral flexibility that operational work required. The answer came to her with crystalline clarity as she looked around the room at people who'd betrayed everything they'd sworn to protect. The difference wasn't in the actions themselves, but in the principles that guided those actions. Her father had died serving something greater than himself. These people lived by serving only their own interests, regardless of the cost to others. Her extraction from the network came 3 weeks later, when coordinated raids by agencies that officially didn't cooperate with each other rolled up the entire espionage ring in a single night. Warren was arrested at her home, Hansen at his office, Martinez at a restaurant where he'd been meeting with foreign handlers. Petrov, with the survival instincts of a career intelligence officer, managed to reach the Russian embassy before he could be taken into custody, but not before his entire network had been compromised. Sarah's role in the operation remained classified. Her cover identity as a potential recruit, protecting her from any connection to the investigation. But she found herself sitting across from Colonel Stone in a different briefing room, facing questions about psychological changes that her extended undercover work had produced. "Your father would be proud," Stone said, reviewing reports that detailed the scope of the network they'd destroyed. This operation prevented dozens of future intelligence compromises and likely saved hundreds of American lives. At what cost? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Warren died in federal custody 3 days ago," Stone replied quietly. "Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially ... People with her level of knowledge don't remain security risks indefinitely." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized that her successful intelligence gathering had led directly to Warren's execution, regardless of the official cause of death. It was the kind of operational necessity that her training had prepared her to accept intellectually, but the emotional reality was more complicated than any psychological conditioning could address. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you become fully operational," Stone said, producing orders that would assign her to missions she couldn't yet imagine. "Your psychological profile suggests you've successfully navigated the moral complexities of intelligence work without losing the ethical framework that makes you suitable for long-term deployment." But as Sarah read her new assignment details, she realized that successfully navigating those moral complexities didn't mean being unaffected by them. She would carry the weight of every decision, every compromise, every life that ended because of intelligence she gathered or actions she took. It was the price of serving something greater than herself, and it was a price her father had been willing to pay. 2 years later, Sarah found herself standing in the same cemetery where her father was buried, but now she was there for a different funeral. Anya had died in a car accident in Denver, 2 weeks after receiving the new identity documents that were supposed to have given her a fresh start in America. The accident investigation had been thorough and found no evidence of foul play, but Sarah knew that coincidences were rare in the world she now inhabited. She stood alone at the graveside, the only person present who'd known Anya's real name and story. The headstone bore the false identity that had been created for her. Jennifer Adams, age 27, survived by no one. It was a lie carved in stone, but it was also the only memorial Anya would receive for her courage in helping expose Viktor Kozlov's arms-dealing network. "She saved lives," Sarah said aloud, though there was no one present to hear the eulogy except the dead. "She made choices that cost her everything, but she saved people she never met and never would have known to. Thank her." As she walked away from the cemetery, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her from cleaning weapons at Apache, Fort Carson, to conducting intelligence operations that would never appear in any public record. It was a journey that had cost her innocence, relationships, and pieces of her soul that she would never recover. But it was also service in the truest sense, protecting people who would never know her name or understand the sacrifices made on their behalf. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Colonel Stone. New orders for a mission that would take her places she'd never been to prevent threats she couldn't yet imagine. She read the preliminary briefing as she walked, already beginning the mental process of becoming someone else, somewhere else, in service of objectives that transcended her personal desires or comfort. The transformation had become routine, as natural as breathing. Sarah Chen, the person, would disappear, replaced by whatever identity the mission required. But somewhere beneath the layers of deception and professional necessity, she carried the memory of her father's gentle hands teaching her to shoot, and the knowledge that some silences were worth breaking, regardless of the cost. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert training facility as Sarah Chen methodically disassembled the Berets M82 sniper rifle, her calloused fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. Each component gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the armory, a symphony of steel and carbon fiber that she knew better than her own heartbeat. The acrid smell of gun oil and cleaning solvent filled her nostrils, a scent that had become as familiar as her mother's perfume once was, back when she still had a mother to remember. "Another perfect breakdown, Chen," muttered Sergeant Rodriguez from across the cluttered workbench, his weathered face creased into what might have been approval. At 45, Rodriguez had seen 3 tours in Afghanistan and carried the weight of those years in his shoulders, but he'd never seen anyone handle weapons maintenance with Sarah's almost reverent care. "You've got magic in those hands, I swear." Sarah didn't look up from her work, instead focusing on the intricate dance of springs and firing pins. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, revealing the sharp angles of her face cheekbones that could cut glass and eyes the color of storm clouds. She was 24, though the intensity in her gaze suggested someone who had lived twice that long. "It's not magic, Sarge, it's respect. These weapons are someone's lifeline out there." The Fort Carson Weapons Maintenance Division buzzed with the constant hum of activity. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows on the concrete walls lined with gun racks and tool cabinets. The air tasted of metal shavings and determination, where young soldiers learned to strip, clean, and reassemble the instruments that might one day save their lives. Sarah had been assigned here for 18 months, ever since her transfer from the 82nd Airborne's Logistics Division, a move that had puzzled many, considering her exemplary service record and the whispered stories of her uncanny accuracy during training exercises. "You know," Rodriguez continued, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag, "Captain Morrison's been asking about you again. Something about your marksmanship scores from basic. Says they're unusual." Sarah's hands paused for just a moment, the bolt carrier group suspended between her palms like a prayer. "Unusual how?" Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to hide her light under a bushel, to blend into the background despite abilities that threatened to set her apart. "Let's just say your qualifying scores would make most snipers weep with envy." Rodriguez leaned against the workbench, his brown eyes studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. 300-yard targets, dead center, every single shot. In weather that had seasoned marksmen struggling to hit the broadside of a barn. The memory flickered through Sarah's mind like a half-forgotten dream. She could still feel the weight of the M4 carbine against her shoulder, the way the world had narrowed to nothing but the crosshairs and her breath. The targets had seemed impossibly small, dancing in the desert heat shimmer, but when she'd squeezed the trigger, time had slowed to honey, and she'd known with the certainty of sunrise exactly where each bullet would find its home. "Lucky shots," she murmured, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Nothing about those moments had felt like luck. They'd felt like coming home. Private Jackson, barely 19 and still carrying baby fat on his cheeks, looked up from the N249 light machine gun he was struggling to clean. "Chen, could you show me how to get this carbon buildup off the gas tube? I've been scrubbing for 20 minutes, and it's not budging." Sarah set down her work and moved to help the young soldier, her movements fluid and economical. She'd grown up in the mountains of Colorado, where her father had taught her that every action should have purpose, every gesture should be efficient. "You're using too much force, Jackson. Let the solvent do the work." She demonstrated with gentle circular motions, and the stubborn carbon began to dissolve like winter snow in spring sunshine. Patience is just as important as strength. As she worked, Sarah's mind wandered to the letter hidden in her footlocker, the one from her father's old commanding officer, Colonel James Mitchell. The envelope bore an official seal she didn't recognize, and the contents had turned her world upside down 3 days ago. "We know who your father was, and we know what you can do. When you're ready to honor his legacy, call the number below." The words had haunted her sleep, mixing with dreams of a man she barely remembered, tall and lean, with calloused hands that could thread a needle or thread a bullet through a playing card at 500 yards. Her father, Staff Sergeant David Chen, had died when she was 8, officially in a training accident at Fort Bragg. But the letter suggested there were layers to his story that she'd never been told. Depths to his service that went far beyond the basic infantry no's listed on his death certificate. "Thanks, Chen," Jackson said, admiring his now pristine weapon. "You've got the touch. Maybe you should be training us instead of just maintaining our gear." "Everyone has their role," Sarah replied, but even as she said it, she felt the familiar itch between her shoulder blades. The restless energy that came from knowing she was capable of more than what her current assignment demanded. It was like being a racehorse forced to pull a plow, functional, necessary, but somehow wrong. The armory door opened with a metallic screech, and Captain Morrison stepped inside, his pressed uniform and polished boots a stark contrast to the oil-stained fatigues worn by the maintenance crew. He was a lean man in his 30s, with intelligent blue eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Behind him walked 2 men. Sarah didn't recognize one in standard Army ACUs, the other in civilian clothes that somehow managed to scream military louder than any uniform. "Sergeant Chen," Morrison called, and the entire armory seemed to hold its breath. "Could I have a word?" Sarah's hands stilled on the weapon she'd been cleaning, every instinct suddenly alert. She'd learned to read the subtleties of military hierarchy, and something about the captain's tone suggested this wasn't a routine maintenance review. "Of course, sir." She followed the 3 men outside into the blazing Colorado sun, where the distant mountains created a jagged horizon line that reminded her of her childhood. The civilian, tall, gray-haired, with eyes like winter, extended a hand. "Sergeant Chen, I'm Colonel Patterson. This is Major Williams from the 5th Special Forces Group." The pieces began clicking together in Sarah's mind like the components of a weapon being assembled. Special Forces. Her father's mysterious letter. The questions about her marksmanship scores. She shook their hands, noting the calluses that spoke of years handling weapons. The way their eyes constantly scanned the environment, even during casual conversation. "We understand you've been doing excellent work in weapons maintenance, Major," Williams said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. He was younger than Patterson, maybe 40, with the lean build of a distance runner and scars that suggested his service had seen more action than ceremony. "But we're more interested in discussing your other talents." "Other talents, sir?" Sarah kept her voice level, though her heart was suddenly hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Colonel Patterson smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Let's cut to the chase, Sergeant. Your marksmanship scores suggest capabilities that are being wasted on maintenance duty. We're here to discuss opportunities that might be more suited to your skill set." The desert wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the training grounds. In the distance, Sarah could hear the rhythmic crack of rifle fire from the range, soldiers honing skills they might never need to use. But standing here, surrounded by men whose very presence seemed to vibrate with barely contained violence, she realized that her own skills might be needed sooner than she'd ever imagined. "What kind of opportunities?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Patterson reached into his pocket and withdrew a small device, a rangefinder, military grade, the kind used for precision shooting at extreme distances. The kind that requires someone who can make impossible shots look routine. The kind that save lives and complete missions when everything else has failed. Sarah took the device, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. She'd used similar equipment during her brief stint at sniper school, the course she'd excelled at before being mysteriously reassigned to maintenance. "And you think I'm that someone?" "We know you are," Major Williams said quietly. "The question is whether you're ready to prove it." They led her to a section of the range she'd never seen before, where targets were set at distances that seemed to stretch toward the horizon itself. The longest target, barely visible even with binoculars, bore a small marker, 2,000 yards, nearly 2 kilometers. A shot that would challenge even the most experienced military snipers. "This is a qualification test," Patterson explained, producing a pristine M40A5 sniper rifle from a hard case. "One shot, no warm-ups, no practice rounds. The rifle is zeroed, but you'll need to account for wind, elevation, humidity, and a dozen other variables that can turn a perfect shot into a complete miss." Sarah accepted the rifle, feeling the familiar surge of rightness that came from holding a precision instrument. The weapon felt like an extension of her own body, the stock settling into her shoulder with the comfort of a lover's embrace. She'd dreamed of moments like this, not the test itself, but the pure connection between shooter, weapon, and target that transcended mere marksmanship and became something almost spiritual. "What happens if I miss?" she asked, though she was already running calculations in her head wind speed from the flags on the range, the slight upward angle required by the target's elevation, the way the desert heat would affect the bullet's trajectory. "Then you go back to cleaning weapons," Patterson said simply. "But we don't think you're going to miss." Sarah settled into a prone position, the rifle bipod steady against the concrete shooting platform. Through the scope, the distant target wavered like a mirage, a small circle of hope in an ocean of sand and sky. She controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow to match the rhythm of the earth itself. This was the moment her father had prepared her for, though he died before he could see her embrace it. Around her, she was dimly aware of the 3 men holding their breath, of Sergeant Rodriguez and the other maintenance crew members who had somehow materialized to witness this impossible moment. But all of that faded into background noise as Sarah's world narrowed to the crosshairs and the target that waited nearly a mile away. She thought of her father's hands guiding hers on her first rifle, of the way he'd whispered that shooting was about more than hitting targets. It was about precision, patience, and the sacred responsibility that came with the power to reach across vast distances. She thought of all the weapons she'd cleaned and maintained, each one a tool that might save a life or complete a mission in the hands of someone who understood their true purpose. The wind died to nothing. The world held its breath. Sarah squeezed the trigger with the slow, steady pressure her father had taught her, and felt the rifle speak its deadly language into the desert silence. The shot echoed across the range like thunder, rolling off the distant mountains and fading into memory. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Major Williams raised his binoculars, and a slow smile spread across his weathered features. "Dead center," he announced, and Sarah felt something fundamental shift in the trajectory of her life. "Welcome to the real war, Sergeant Chen." But, as she stood and handed the rifle back to Colonel Patterson, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this perfect shot had just painted a target on her own back, that proving her abilities might be the easy part, and that the real test would be surviving what came next. Sarah's life fell into a new rhythm after that day on the range, though calling it rhythm was like calling an avalanche a gentle snowfall. She still reported to the armory each morning at 0600, still maintained the weapons with the same meticulous care that had become her trademark. But now there was an undercurrent of anticipation that made her hands shake slightly when she thought no one was looking. The letter from Colonel Patterson had arrived 3 days after the test shot, delivered not through military channels but by a civilian courier who'd waited while she read the contents and then departed without a word. "Report to Building 847 at 1400 hours on Friday. Bring nothing. Tell no one." The building number meant nothing to her, but something in the stark simplicity of the message suggested that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. "You've been different lately," Sergeant Rodriguez observed as they worked side by side on a batch of M4S that had returned from a training exercise caked with mud and neglect. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, but Sarah caught him glancing at her with concern. Distant, like your mind's somewhere else. Sarah focused on the weapon in front of her, using the familiar motions of disassembly to ground herself in the present moment. "Just thinking about some things, Sarge, nothing important." But that was a lie, and they both knew it. Everything felt important now, weighted with possibility and danger in equal measure. She'd started noticing things she'd never paid attention to before, the way certain soldiers moved with a different kind of awareness, their eyes constantly scanning for threats that existed only in their trained imagination. She'd begun to recognize the subtle signs of special operations personnel, the non-regulation gear worn in regulation ways, the casual confidence that came from knowing you were among the elite, the way conversations died when certain names were mentioned. Her dreams had changed too. Where once she'd slept deeply, exhausted by physical labor and routine, now she found herself waking before dawn with her heart racing, fragments of impossible shots and distant targets dancing behind her eyelids. Sometimes she dreamed of her father not as the shadowy figure from her childhood memories, but as a young soldier not much older than she was now, his eye pressed to a scope as he made calculations that would determine whether someone lived or died. "Rodriguez," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the question that emerged. "What do you know about my father?" The sergeant's hand stilled on the bolt carrier he'd been cleaning. When he looked up, his expression was carefully neutral, the kind of neutrality that came from years of navigating military politics and classified information. "Your father? He was infantry, wasn't he? Died in a training accident? That's what I was told." Sarah set down her tools and faced him directly. "But lately I've been wondering if there was more to the story." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words with the care of someone who understood that some truths were more dangerous than lies. Finally he spoke, his voice low enough that the other soldiers in the armory wouldn't overhear. "Your father was a good soldier, Chun, better than good. But some soldiers serve in ways that don't make it into the official records." The cryptic response sent a chill down Sarah's spine, confirming suspicion she'd been afraid to acknowledge. "You knew him. I knew of him." Rodriguez returned to his work, but his movements were more careful now, deliberate. This is a small community, and men like your father, they leave impressions. Stories get told, usually late at night over beers, usually by people who shouldn't be telling them. What kind of stories? But Rodriguez just shook his head. The kind that die with the people who tell them. The kind that are better left buried. He looked up at her again, and this time his eyes held a warning. Be careful, Chun. Some doors, once you open them, you can't close again. That evening, Sarah sat in her barracks room staring at the letter that had started everything. The one from Colonel Mitchell that had first suggested her father's death might be more complicated than she'd been told. Her roommate, Specialist Janet Kim, was out at the NCO club, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that her comfortable, predictable life was about to explode into fragments. She'd grown up in a small town outside Colorado Springs, raised by her grandmother after her father's death and her mother's subsequent descent into alcoholism and depression. Grandma Chun had been a stern but loving woman who'd emphasized education, hard work, and the importance of being self-sufficient. She'd never spoken much about Sarah's father, beyond saying that he'd been a good man who'd served his country and died too young. It wasn't until Sarah had enlisted herself that she'd begun to understand the gaps in that story. Military records were thorough, obsessively detailed, but her father's file contained strange inconsistencies, deployment dates that didn't align with official unit histories, commendations for actions that weren't described, and long periods where he seemed to have simply vanished from the bureaucratic paper trail that followed every soldier from enlistment to discharge. She'd tried to dismiss these discrepancies as clerical errors, the kind of administrative confusion that plagued any large organization. But the letter from Colonel Mitchell had changed that, suggesting that the inconsistencies weren't mistakes but careful omissions, designed to hide a truth that certain people weren't ready for the world to know. Friday arrived with the relentless inevitability of sunrise. Sarah went through her morning routine with mechanical precision physical training at 0530. Shower, breakfast, then her usual duties in the armory. But every minute felt stretched, time moving like honey in winter as she waited for 1400 hours and whatever revelation awaited her in Building 847. The building itself was unremarkable, a single-story concrete structure on the outskirts of the base, surrounded by chain-link fence and bearing no identifying markers beyond the number stenciled on its door. Sarah showed her ID to the guard at the gate, noted the way his eyes lingered on her face as if he'd been told to expect her, and walked toward what felt like either salvation or damnation. Colonel Patterson was waiting inside, along with Major Williams and two other men she didn't recognize, one in Army dress blues with enough ribbons to suggest a career spent in places where ribbons were earned the hard way, the other in civilian clothes that screamed intelligence community in a way that somehow managed to be both subtle and unmistakable. Sergeant Chun, Patterson greeted her with a nod toward an empty chair at a conference table. Thank you for coming. Please sit. The room was spartanly furnished but filled with an energy that made Sarah's skin prickle with awareness. Maps covered one wall, not the usual tactical maps she was used to seeing, but satellite imagery of regions she couldn't immediately identify. A second wall held photographs that looked like surveillance shots, faces that meant nothing to her but were clearly significant to the men in this room. Before we begin, Patterson continued, I need you to understand that everything discussed in this room is classified at the highest levels. You will not speak of this meeting to anyone, regardless of their rank or clearance level. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Sarah's voice sounded strange to her own ears, calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The man in dress blues leaned forward, his pale eyes studying her with uncomfortable intensity. I'm General Morrison, no relation to your company commander. I knew your father, Sergeant Chun, knew him well. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming what she'd suspected, but hoped wasn't true. Sir? Staff Sergeant David Chen was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege of serving with. Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. He saved more lives than we'll ever be able to count, completed missions that officially never happened, and died serving his country in ways that will never be acknowledged in any public ceremony. Sarah felt tears threatening and forced them back through sheer willpower. He wasn't infantry, was he? He was many things. The civilian spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't place. But above all, he was a marksman, like you. They showed her photographs, then her father as a young soldier, barely older than Sarah was now, holding rifles she recognized and others she'd only seen in classified manuals. In one image, he was prone behind, a massive scope, his eye pressed to glass that could reach across impossible distances. In another, he stood with a group of men whose faces had been digitally obscured, their unit patches removed or blurred beyond recognition. Your father served with the activity, Patterson explained, and Sarah felt her world shift on its axis. The Intelligence Support Activity was a name whispered in certain circles, a unit so classified that its very existence was denied by official sources. He was part of a program that doesn't exist, training marksmen for operations that never happened. And now you want me to follow in his footsteps? It wasn't a question. We want to offer you the opportunity to use your abilities in service of your country, General Morrison corrected. But I want you to understand what that means. Your father died because he made a choice to put his mission before his own safety. He died because sometimes the best soldiers don't come home. Sarah stared at the photographs, trying to reconcile the young man in the images with her hazy childhood memories. Her father had been gentle with her, patient when teaching her to shoot, careful to emphasize safety and responsibility along with marksmanship. But these photographs showed a different side of him, a harder edge that came from knowing that his skills might be used to end lives as well as save them. What would be expected of me? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer would fundamentally change who she was. Training, initially, the civilian replied. Advanced marksmanship, but also counterintelligence, infiltration, survival. You'd learn to disappear into civilian populations, to gather intelligence to make shots under conditions that would challenge the best snipers in the world. And then? Then you'd go places that don't appear on maps, do things that don't appear in reports, and serve your country in ways that history will never record. Patterson's voice was quiet, but firm. It's not a life everyone can handle, Sergeant. It requires sacrifices that most people can't imagine. Sarah thought of her quiet life in the armory, the predictable routine of maintenance and inspection, the safety of anonymity among soldiers who saw her as competent but unremarkable. She thought of Sergeant Rodriguez's warning about doors that couldn't be closed once opened, and of her father's death in a training accident that was beginning to seem like anything but an accident. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course. Patterson stood, and the others followed his lead. But understand that time is a luxury we don't always have. Events are moving that may require your unique skills sooner rather than later. They escorted her from the building, leaving her standing in the afternoon sun with her head spinning and her future hanging in the balance. As she walked back toward the main part of the base, Sarah realized that her life had already changed, that the moment she'd made that perfect shot on the 2,000-yard range, she'd started down a path that led inevitably to this choice. That night, she called her grandmother for the first time in months, needing to hear a voice that connected her to the person she'd been before military service had begun reshaping her into someone she barely recognized. Sarah, honey, Grandma Chun's voice was warm despite the distance and the late hour. I was wondering when you'd call. How are you doing, sweetheart? I'm fine, Grandma. Just thinking about Dad lately, about what he was really like. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when her grandmother spoke again, her voice carried a sadness that Sarah had never heard before. Your father was a good man who made hard choices, Sarah. He loved you more than life itself, but he also loved his country. Sometimes those two loves came into conflict. Did you know what he really did in the army? Another pause, longer this time. I knew enough to be proud of him and terrified for him in equal measure. I knew enough to understand that some service requires sacrifices that go beyond what most people are asked to give. And if I had the opportunity to serve the way he did, what would you say? I'd say that you're his daughter, and that some things run in the blood whether we want them to or not. Her grandmother's voice was soft but steady. I'd also say that whatever choice you make it with your eyes wide open and your heart committed. Half measures will get you killed in work like that. After they hung up, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, knowing that sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. Tomorrow she would have to give Colonel Patterson her answer, and that answer would determine not just her career, but her very identity. She thought of her father, young and confident in those photographs, and wondered if he'd lain awake on a night like this, weighing the same impossible choice between safety and service. By morning, she knew what she had to do. The training began immediately, as if Colonel Patterson had known what her answer would be before she'd spoken it. Within 48 hours of accepting his offer, Sarah found herself on a transport plane, heading to a location that didn't appear on any civilian map. Her previous life at Fort Carson already feeling like a half-remembered dream. The facility, if it could be called that, was hidden in the mountains of Montana, accessible only by a road that switched back through wilderness, so remote that cell towers were nothing but urban legends. Sarah caught glimpses of it through the helicopter's windows during the final approach. Concrete structures that seemed to grow from the mountainside itself, camouflaged so effectively that they might have been natural rock formations if not for the occasional glint of reinforced glass or the geometric precision of their angles. Her fellow trainees were an eclectic mix of military specialties and civilian backgrounds, united only by their exceptional marksmanship scores and their willingness to disappear from their previous lives for an indefinite period. There was Marcus Rodriguez, no relation to her former sergeant, a former Marine Scout sniper with 3 tours in Afghanistan and eyes that had seen too much death. Elena Vasquez had been Border Patrol before answering whatever call had brought her here, her knowledge of smuggling routes and human trafficking patterns, apparently as valuable as her ability to place shots at extreme range. The civilian contingent was more mysterious. James Park claimed to have been a competitive shooter before his recruitment, but something in the way he moved suggested military training that went deeper than weekend competitions. Rebecca Singh's background was similarly vague, though her familiarity with foreign languages and cultural nuances hinted at intelligence work that predated her arrival at the facility. Their instructor was a man known only as Colonel Stone, a name that Sarah suspected was as manufactured as his carefully neutral accent and deliberately unremarkable appearance. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and laugh lines that suggested a man who enjoyed life, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had made peace with violence as a tool of statcraft. Marksmanship, Stone announced on their first morning, standing before a class of 12 students in a briefing room that looked more like a university lecture hall than a military training facility, is the least important skill you'll learn here. The statement sent a murmur through the assembled trainees, all of whom had been recruited specifically for their shooting abilities. Sarah found herself leaning forward, intrigued despite her growing apprehension about what she'd gotten herself into. Don't misunderstand me, Stone continued with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Your ability to put bullets exactly where you want them is why you're here. But any moderately talented civilian can learn to shoot tight groups at known distances under controlled conditions. What separates a marksman from an operator is everything else: the ability to remain undetected for days or weeks, to gather intelligence while maintaining cover, to make critical decisions under pressure when there's no backup coming and failure means death. The first weeks of training were unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her conventional military service. Physical conditioning pushed them beyond what she'd thought possible, not just building strength and endurance, but developing the kind of body awareness that would allow them to remain motionless for hours while maintaining the fine motor control necessary for precision shooting. Mental conditioning was equally rigorous, exercises in compartmentalization that taught them to separate their emotions from their actions, to function effectively despite psychological stress that would break ordinary soldiers. But it was the psychological profiling that disturbed Sarah most. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a civilian contractor with credentials from universities Sarah had only heard of in movies, conducted individual sessions that felt more like interrogations than therapy. Warren had a way of asking questions that seemed innocent but left Sarah feeling exposed, as if her deepest thoughts were being cataloged for purposes she couldn't understand. "Tell me about your father," Warren said during one of their sessions, her pen poised over a legal pad filled with notes in handwriting too neat to be natural. "I've already provided his service record," Sarah replied, though she knew that wasn't what the doctor was asking. "I'm interested in your emotional connection to his memory. How does following in his footsteps make you feel?" Sarah considered lying, giving the kind of sanitized response that would satisfy the paperwork requirements while revealing nothing of substance. But something in Warren's patient gaze suggested that deception would be both futile and counterproductive. "Proud, scared, sometimes angry that he died before I could really know him." Angry at whom? "At him for choosing duty over family. At my mother for falling apart after his death. At myself for taking so long to understand what kind of man he really was." The words came out in a rush, emotion she'd buried for years suddenly demanding acknowledgement. Warren made notes with mechanical precision. "And now you're making the same choice he made. Duty over personal relationships. How do you think that will affect you in the long term?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, and realized it was the first completely honest thing she'd said during the entire session. The marksmanship training itself was unlike anything she'd experienced during conventional military service. "We're basic." Training had focused on combat accuracy at typical engagement distances. This program pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible with rifles and optics. They trained in all weather conditions, at distances that strained the limits of ballistics, with equipment that officially didn't exist. Sarah's natural abilities, already exceptional, began to develop into something that bordered on supernatural. She learned to read wind patterns from the movement of grass a mile away, to compensate for atmospheric conditions that would affect bullet trajectory over extreme distances. More importantly, she learned to make these calculations instinctively, without conscious thought, so that her shooting became an extension of her will rather than a deliberate technical exercise. "Outstanding work, Chun," Colonel Stone observed after a particularly challenging session where she'd managed to place 5 consecutive shots into a 6-inch circle at 1,800 meters in gusting crosswinds. "Your father would be proud." The comment stopped Sarah cold, her hand freezing on the bolt of her rifle. "You knew my father personally, sir?" Stone's expression became carefully neutral, the mask of professional distance sliding back into place. "I knew of his work. His reputation preceded him in certain circles." But Sarah caught something in his tone, a slight hesitation that suggested their connection might have been more personal than professional. She filed the observation away, adding it to a growing collection of inconsistencies and half-truths that surrounded her father's service record. 3 months into training, they began learning skills that had nothing to do with marksmanship but everything to do with survival in the gray world they were being prepared to enter. Urban concealment techniques taught them to blend into civilian populations, to move through crowded spaces without being remembered or tracked. Language training provided basic conversational ability in Arabic, Farsi Mandarin, and Russian enough to understand overheard conversations and ask simple questions without revealing their true identities. Electronics and communications. Training was perhaps most eye-opening. They learned to use equipment that could intercept cell phone calls, track vehicle movements via satellite, and communicate across vast distances without detection. Sarah discovered that she had an aptitude for technical surveillance that surprised her instructors and herself, an ability to understand complex systems intuitively and find weaknesses that more experienced operators might miss. "You're thinking like an engineer," Elena Vasquez observed one evening as they worked together on a particularly challenging encryption exercise. "Most of us are just trying to follow the manual, but you're seeing how the pieces fit together." Sarah shrugged, focusing on the code sequences displayed on her monitor. "My grandmother always said I was good at puzzles. I guess this is just a more complicated version of the crosswords we used to do together." But even as she spoke, Sarah realized that her growing proficiency in these areas was creating distance between her and the other trainees. They'd started as equals, united by their exceptional marksmanship and their willingness to serve in unconventional roles. But as training progressed, it became clear that some were adapting to their new reality better than others. Marcus Rodriguez struggled with the psychological aspects of their training, his combat experience making it difficult for him to embrace the deception and manipulation that were core elements of intelligence work. Rebecca Singh excelled at human intelligence gathering but showed concerning signs of enjoying the power that came with their developing skill set. James Park maintained the same cheerful facade he'd worn since their first day, but Sarah began to notice small signs of stress, a slight tremor in his hands during weapons maintenance, moments of inattention during briefings that suggested his mind was elsewhere. The first real test came during their 6th month of training. Colonel Stone announced it simply, without fanfare or explanation. They would be conducting a live exercise that would determine their suitability for ASCR, operational deployment. Those who passed would continue to advanced training and eventual assignment to active missions. Those who failed would be reassigned to conventional units with no memory of their time at the facility, a promise that carried implications Sarah didn't want to explore too deeply. The exercise itself was deceptively straightforward. Each trainee would be inserted into a major metropolitan area with false identification, limited funds, and a single objective: identify and photograph a specific individual, whose only description was a name and a vague physical description. They would have 1 week to complete the mission while avoiding detection by local law enforcement, federal agents, and their own classmates, who would be operating in the same city with similar objectives. Sarah drew Denver, a city she knew well from her childhood but would now have to navigate as someone else entirely. Her target was identified only as Michael Kowalski, described as a 35-year-old businessman with possible connections to arms trafficking. The file contained no photographs, no known addresses, and no guidance beyond a warning that Kowalski was extremely cautious and likely to be armed. She spent her first day in Denver relearning the city through new eyes, identifying potential surveillance points, escape routes, and safe houses where she could retreat if the mission went wrong. The Denver of her childhood, place of family, visits, and innocent exploration had been replaced by a tactical puzzle where every street corner and building entrance represented potential opportunity or danger. Finding Kowalski required skills she'd never imagined needing. She started with public records, using techniques Dr. Warren had taught them during information-gathering exercises. Business licenses, property records, court filings, all the digital breadcrumbs that modern life inevitably left behind. Within 2 days, she'd identified 3 possible Michael Kowalskis in the Denver metropolitan area, each with connections that could potentially tie to arms trafficking. The first turned out to be a retired plumber whose only weapons were a collection of hunting rifles. The second was a legitimate businessman whose arms trafficking involved prosthetic limbs for veterans. But the third, Michael Anthony Kowalski, age 34, owner of an import-export company with shipping addresses in countries that didn't appear on most tourists. Itineraries set off every instinct, Colonel. Stone's training had developed in her. Sarah spent 3 days conducting surveillance on Kowalski's office building, a nondescript structure in an industrial district that saw little foot traffic after business hours. She learned his routines, his security precautions, the way he moved through the world with the hypervigilance of someone who knew he had enemies. Most importantly, she learned that he wasn't alone. At least 2 men provided discreet security, professionals who carried themselves with the casual alertness that marked them as former military. The photograph she needed came during Kowalski's lunch break on Thursday, when he emerged from his building to walk to a nearby restaurant. Sarah had positioned herself on a rooftop 2 blocks away, using a telephoto lens to capture images that would satisfy the mission requirements while remaining completely undetected. Through the camera's viewfinder, she watched Kowalski pause on the sidewalk, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. For a moment, his eyes seemed to look directly at her hiding spot, and Sarah felt her heart skip as she wondered if her position had been compromised. But then Kowalski continued walking, and Sarah realized that his pause had been simple caution, rather than specific awareness of her surveillance. She'd completed her mission successfully, but the experience left her shaken in ways she couldn't entirely explain. There had been something in Kowalski's momentary alertness that reminded her of her father, the same quality of watchful awareness that she'd inherited without understanding its source. The debriefing at the facility was conducted by Colonel Stone personally, and Sarah found herself facing questions that had little to do with the technical aspects of her mission. How had she felt about conducting surveillance on an American citizen? What would she have done if Kowalski had detected her presence? How far would she have been willing to go to complete her mission if circumstances had required more aggressive action? "You did well, Chen," Stone concluded after reviewing her photographs and mission report. "Better than well. You showed patience, creativity, and the kind of operational security that keeps people alive in hostile environments." "Thank you, sir." But Sarah sensed there was more coming, a qualification that would complicate her satisfaction with a successful first mission. "However," Stone continued, and there it was, "your psychological profile suggests some concerning trends. Dr. Warren believes you may be compartmentalizing your emotions in ways that could become problematic under operational stress." Sarah felt a flash of anger at the assessment, though she was careful not to let it show on her face. "With respect, sir, I completed the mission exactly as briefed. My emotional state didn't interfere with my operational effectiveness." "No, it didn't, but effectiveness isn't our only concern." Stone leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same intensity she'd seen him apply to weapons maintenance or ballistics calculations. "The work we're preparing you for requires a delicate balance between emotional detachment and human connection. Too much emotion, and you make mistakes that get people killed. Too little, and you become something that your country shouldn't ask its soldiers to become." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she returned to her quarters, mingling with memories of her father and questions about what kind of man he'd been when he wasn't being the gentle parent she remembered. Had he struggled with the same balance Stone was describing? Had there been parts of his service that had required him to become someone she wouldn't have recognized? Her answers came sooner than expected, in the form of a classified file that appeared on her bunk one evening with no explanation of how it had gotten there or who had authorized its release. The cover bore her father's name and service number, along with classification markings she'd learned to recognize during her training. Inside were documents that painted a picture of Staff Sergeant David Chen that was simultaneously inspiring and terrifying. Her father had been involved in operations across 3 continents, missions that had prevented terrorist attacks, disrupted weapons shipments, and eliminated threats to American interests before they could fully develop. He'd saved hundreds of lives through actions that could never be publicly acknowledged, and he'd done it with the same precision and dedication that he'd brought to teaching his daughter to shoot tin cans off fence posts. But the file also contained after-action reports that spoke of extreme measures and operational necessities in language carefully crafted to obscure the reality of what had been required. Reading between the lines, Sarah began to understand that her father's service had included moments that would have tested his humanity in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. The final document in the file was a psychological evaluation, dated 6 months before her father's death, written by a doctor whose name had been redacted, but whose conclusions were crystal clear. Subject continues to demonstrate exceptional operational effectiveness, but shows signs of increasing emotional isolation. Recommend careful monitoring and possible intervention if symptoms progress. Long-term prognosis for psychological health remains uncertain. Sarah closed the file and sat in the darkness of her quarters, trying to reconcile the man described in these clinical reports with her memories of a father who had been patient, gentle, and utterly devoted to his family. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the same qualities that made him an exceptional father had also made him capable of the terrible necessities his service had required. The next phase of training began immediately, as if the file had been a test in itself, measuring her reaction to learning the full truth about her father's legacy. Advanced infiltration techniques took them into increasingly complex scenarios, where the lines between right and wrong became blurred beyond recognition. They learned to assume false identities so completely that they could pass polygraph tests while living lives that were complete fabrications. They practiced interrogation techniques that would extract vital information from unwilling subjects without leaving physical evidence of coercion. Most disturbing were the exercises in what Colonel Stone euphemistically called permanent problem solving scenarios where conventional law enforcement or military action couldn't address threats to national security, situations that required more direct and final solutions. Sarah found herself learning skills she'd never wanted to possess, knowledge that felt like a corruption of everything her father had taught her about the responsible use of force. "You're troubled by this training," Dr. Warren observed during one of their sessions, her pen poised over notes that would become part of Sarah's permanent psychological profile. "Shouldn't I be?" Sarah replied, though she was careful to keep her tone neutral and professional. "That depends. Are you troubled by the techniques themselves, or by the possibility that you might be capable of using them?" The question cut deeper than Sarah wanted to admit. During the exercises, she discovered a capacity for deception and manipulation that frightened her. Worse, she'd found herself enjoying the intellectual challenge of outmaneuvering opponents who had no idea they were being played. There was a seductive quality to the power that came with these skills, a sense of superiority over ordinary people who moved through the world without understanding its hidden dangers. "Both," she answered honestly. Warren made notes with mechanical precision. "That's actually a positive indicator. Operators who don't struggle with these capabilities tend to be unsuitable for long-term deployment. The capacity for moral flexibility is necessary, but it must be balanced by an underlying ethical framework that prevents complete corruption. And if that balance fails, then we have containment protocols," Warren said simply. And something in her tone suggested that those protocols weren't merely bureaucratic procedures. As training progressed through its final phases, Sarah began to understand that she was being shaped into something that existed in the spaces between conventional morality and operational necessity. She was learning to be a weapon that could think, a tool of statcraft that could adapt to circumstances that no policy manual could anticipate. The realization should have terrified her more than it did. The graduation exercise was announced with the same understated simplicity that had characterized every major milestone in their training. Each surviving trainee 3 had been quietly reassigned during the psychological conditioning phase, would be given a real mission, with real consequences and real targets who posed genuine threats to American interests. Success would mean operational deployment and acceptance into a community that officially didn't exist. Failure would mean, well, Colonel Stone was characteristically vague about the alternatives. Sarah's mission took her to Eastern Europe, to a city whose name she wasn't allowed to record, and a target whose identity came with a file thick enough to serve as a weapon itself. Viktor Kozlov, former Spetsnaz, current arms dealer, suspected of supplying weapons to terrorist organizations across the Middle East. Intelligence suggested he was planning a major transaction that would put advanced American military technology into the hands of groups that would use it against American soldiers and civilians. The mission parameters were simple: gather intelligence on Kozlov's operation, identify his buyers and suppliers, and prevent the transaction from taking place. The methods for accomplishing these objectives were left entirely to her discretion, with the understanding that some situations might require permanent solutions to ensure operational success. Sarah spent 2 weeks in the unnamed city, living as a freelance journalist researching a story on post-Soviet economics. The cover identity felt natural, allowing her to ask questions and visit locations that would have been suspicious for a tourist, but were perfectly reasonable for someone writing about regional development. More importantly, it gave her access to the kind of people who might know about Kozlov's activities without necessarily being directly involved in them. The city itself was a study in contrasts, gleaming new construction rising beside crumbling Soviet-era apartment blocks, expensive cars navigating streets filled with potholes that hadn't been repaired since the Berlin Wall fell. It was a place where capitalism and corruption had merged into something that was neither entirely legal nor completely criminal, where men like Kozlov could operate with impunity as long as they paid the right bribes to the right officials. Finding Kozlov required patience and careful cultivation of sources who lived in the gray areas between legitimate business and outright criminality. Sarah spent hours in bars and cafes, building relationships with people who traded in information as readily as they traded in goods and services. She learned to drink vodka without showing its effects, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to present herself as someone who could be trusted with secrets that could get people killed. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source: a young woman named Anya, who worked as a translator for various businessmen who needed to communicate with international clients. Anya was perhaps 25, with the kind of beauty that had probably saved her from the economic desperation that trapped so many of her generation. But behind her carefully applied makeup and designer clothes, Sarah recognized something familiar: the hypervigilance of someone who survived by staying one step ahead of dangerous people. "You ask many questions about business in our city," Anya observed one evening as they shared drinks in a hotel bar that catered to foreign visitors. "But the kind of business you write about, it is not always safe to know too much. I'm just interested in how the economy has developed since independence," Sarah replied, though she sensed that Anya wasn't buying the innocent journalist act. "Independence," Anya laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "We traded Soviet masters for new masters. The faces changed, the uniforms changed, but the game remains the same. Men with guns decide who prospers and who disappears." It was an opening, carefully constructed but genuine enough to build on. Sarah spent the next hour listening to Anya describe a city where legitimate business and organized crime had become indistinguishable, where former intelligence officers and military personnel had transitioned seamlessly into private enterprise that served the same state interests they'd served in uniform. "There is a man," Anya said finally, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "who they say can find anything, sell anything, make anything disappear. Americans, Russians, Chinese, they all come to him when they need things that cannot be purchased through normal channels. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. Sounds like the kind of person who might make an interesting interview subject. This is not a man who gives interviews, Anya replied, and something in her tone suggested personal knowledge that went beyond street rumors. But perhaps I know someone who knows someone who might be willing to arrange a meeting. For the right price, of course. The price turned out to be more complicated than simple money. Anya wanted passage to the United States, specifically refugee status that would allow her to disappear from a life that was becoming increasingly dangerous. She claimed to have information about Kozlov's operation that would be valuable to American intelligence, but she wanted guarantees that Sarah couldn't provide without compromising her cover identity. It was the kind of situation Colonel Stone's training had prepared her for a moment when operational necessity conflicted with personal ethics, when the mission's success might require her to make promises she couldn't keep to someone who was risking everything to help her. Sarah found herself thinking of her father's psychological evaluation, wondering if he'd faced similar choices and how they'd affected him. "I can't promise you refugee status," Sarah said finally, choosing honesty over expediency. "But I can promise that your information will reach people who have the authority to help you, and that your cooperation will be remembered favorably if you ever apply for asylum." Anya studied her for a long moment, and Sarah realized she was being evaluated. With the same intensity she'd learned to apply to potential assets. "You are not really a journalist, are you?" The direct question hung in the air between them, laden with implications that could destroy Sarah's mission or create an opportunity for intelligence gathering that went far beyond her original objectives. Her answer would determine not just her operational success, but potentially Anya's survival. "I'm someone who wants to stop very bad people from doing very bad things," Sarah said carefully. "And sometimes that requires pretending to be someone I'm not." It was enough. Anya nodded slowly, and Sarah realized she'd just crossed a line from intelligence gathering into human recruitment, a kokana skill that would define much of her future operational work. The meeting with Viktor Kozlov took place in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a cavernous space that smelled of motor oil and decades of cigarette smoke. Sarah arrived as the journalist persona she'd carefully constructed, but she'd also come prepared for the possibility that her cover might be blown and more direct action would be required. The weight of the concealed pistol against her ribs was both comforting and terrifying, a reminder that she'd moved far beyond the theoretical exercises of her training. Kozlov himself was not what she'd expected. Where the intelligence files had suggested a stereotypical Russian arms dealer, burly, crude, dangerous in an obvious way, the reality was a man who could have been a university professor or a successful businessman. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog and assess everything they saw. When he spoke, his English was flawless, tinged with an accent that suggested education at Western universities. "Miss Anderson," he greeted her, using the false name that had taken weeks to establish through the city's network of fixers and information brokers. "Anya tells me you're interested in writing about entrepreneurship in our region. A fascinating topic, though perhaps more complex than your readers might appreciate." Sarah accepted his handshake, noting the calluses that suggested familiarity with weapons despite his civilized appearance. "I'm particularly interested in how former military personnel have adapted to civilian business opportunities. The transition from service to private enterprise seems to have been quite successful for many people." Kozlov's smile was genuine, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed, we learned valuable skills during our military service: logistics, personnel management, international relations. It was natural to apply those skills in the civilian sector." They walked through the warehouse as he spoke, past crates and containers that bore shipping labels from dozens of countries. Sarah's trained eye caught details that her journalistic cover wouldn't have noticed: the specific dimensions of certain containers, The way some areas of the warehouse were clearly off-limits to casual visitors. The subtle security measures that suggested the facility housed more than legitimate commercial goods. Of course, Kozlov continued, the definition of legitimate can be quite flexible in our current economic environment. What matters is meeting market demand, regardless of the artificial barriers that various governments attempt to impose. It was as close to a confession as Sarah was likely to get without compromising her cover, and she recognized it as both an opportunity and a test. Kozlov was probing to see if the American journalist might be interested in more than just writing articles about post-Soviet entrepreneurship. Market demand certainly seems to be strong, Sarah observed, gesturing toward the warehouse's obvious prosperity. I imagine your clients come from all over the world. Indeed they do. Though some clients are more discerning than others. They have specific needs that require specialized solutions. Kozlov paused beside a shipping container, whose lock bore recent scratches that suggested frequent opening and closing. Would you like to see some examples of our more specialized inventory? The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Accepting would move her closer to gathering the intelligence her mission required, but it would also commit her to maintaining a deception that was becoming increasingly complex. Refusing might preserve her cover, but could cost her the chance to document Kozlov's operation with the detail necessary for successful interdiction. I'd be very interested, Sarah replied, hoping her voice conveyed professional curiosity rather than operational tension. What Kozlov showed her in the next hour would haunt her dreams for years to come. Container after container revealed weapons that should never have existed outside. Military armories, advanced American rifle systems that had somehow found their way from classified development programs to illegal arms markets. Russian anti-aircraft missiles that could bring down civilian airliners. European explosives that could level city blocks. It was enough firepower to equip a small army or supply a dozen terrorist organizations. Impressive inventory, Sarah managed, though her mouth had gone dry as she began to understand the scope of Kozlov's operation. This wasn't simply arms dealing, it was a systematic effort to destabilize entire regions by ensuring that the most dangerous weapons technology found its way into the hands of the most dangerous people. We pride ourselves on meeting our clients' needs, Kozlov replied, and this time his smile held genuine warmth. In fact, we have a major transaction scheduled for next week that will satisfy several long-standing orders. Perhaps you'd like to observe the process. It might provide excellent material for your article. Sarah's training screamed warnings about the invitation, but her operational instincts recognized it as an unprecedented opportunity. If she could document the transaction, identify the buyers, record the weapons transfers, gather evidence that would support both criminal prosecution and military interdiction, she could accomplish far more than her original mission parameters had envisioned. That sounds fascinating, she said, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged animal. I'd be honored to observe your business practices firsthand. The transaction was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a location Kozlov wouldn't reveal until the day itself. Standard operational security that Sarah recognized from her own training. She spent the intervening days carefully documenting everything she'd learned, encrypting reports that would be transmitted to Colonel Stone's people through communication channels that officially didn't exist. But it was during those quiet days of preparation that Sarah began to realize how profoundly her time undercover had changed her. She'd been living as someone else for weeks, thinking like someone else, making decisions that the Sarah Chen who'd cleaned weapons at Fort Carson would never have contemplated. The line between her operational identity and her true self had blurred in ways that Dr. Warren's psychological training had prepared her for intellectually, but not emotionally. The revelation came through Anya, who'd become both a valuable intelligence asset and something approaching a friend during Sarah's time in the city. They were sharing dinner at a small restaurant that catered to locals rather than foreign visitors, and Anya was describing her hopes for a new life in America. "I think about it every day," Anya said, her eyes bright with possibilities that Sarah knew might never materialize. A place where I could be safe, where I could use my languages to help people instead of helping men like Kozlov move their poison around the world. "You've worked for him before?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Many times. Translating, arranging meetings, sometimes carrying messages to people who prefer not to meet face to face." Anya's expression darkened. "I told myself I was just earning money, that I wasn't responsible for what these men did with the words I helped them exchange. But I know better now." Sarah found herself studying Anya's face, recognizing something of her own moral struggle reflected in the younger woman's features. They were both people who'd compromised their principles in service of larger goals, though their motivations were different. Anya was trying to survive in a world that offered few choices to young women without family connections or inherited wealth. Sarah was serving a country that sometimes required its soldiers to do terrible things for the greater good. "What changed your mind?" Sarah asked. "I saw what happened to a village in Chechnya after Kozlov sold missiles to rebels there. Pictures on the internet, children who died when their school was bombed, families destroyed because someone decided they could make money from other people's wars." Anya's voice was steady, but Sarah caught the slight tremor that suggested deeply buried trauma. "I realized that every word I translated, every meeting I arranged, was connected to suffering I would never see but could never escape." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, forcing her to confront questions she'd been avoiding since her training began. How many of the weapons she was documenting would eventually kill innocent people? How many of the intelligence reports she was filing would be used to justify actions that she'd never be told about? Was there a meaningful difference between Anya's complicity and her own? Tuesday arrived with overcast skies that matched Sarah's increasingly dark mood about her mission. Kozlov had provided coordinates for a location outside the city, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through forests that had probably witnessed centuries of violence and betrayal. Sarah drove a rental car that contained enough hidden surveillance equipment to document whatever she was about to witness, but she also carried weapons and communication gear that would allow her to call for extraction if the situation turned hostile. The transaction site was an abandoned collective farm, its empty buildings providing cover from aerial surveillance, while offering multiple escape routes if law enforcement or military forces attempted to interfere. Sarah positioned herself in an equipment shed that provided clear sightlines to the main farmyard while concealing her presence from the participants in whatever was about to unfold. The buyers arrived first, 3 men in expensive suits who moved with the casual confidence of people accustomed to violence. Sarah recognized their type from intelligence briefings, representatives of organizations that funded their political objectives through drug trafficking, human smuggling, and terrorism. They weren't soldiers in any conventional sense, but they were every bit as dangerous as uniformed combatants. Kozlov's arrival was more theatrical, his convoy of black SUVs announcing his presence like a military parade. But it was the cargo trucks that followed that made Sarah's blood run cold. 4 vehicles, each carrying weapons that could outfit a small army or turn an urban area into a war zone. Through her telephoto lens, she documented everything: faces, vehicle license plates, cargo manifest sheets that detailed the transaction scope. The negotiation itself was conducted in English, allowing Sarah to record conversations that would provide prosecutorial evidence if the intelligence she was gathering ever made it to conventional law enforcement. But as she listened to men casually discussing the sale of weapons that would inevitably kill innocents, Sarah felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of her mission. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. These weren't enemy soldiers she was observing. They were criminals whose activities would result in the deaths of people who had never chosen to participate in any conflict. The weapons Kozlov was selling would end up in the hands of terrorists who would use them against civilian targets, rebels who would turn peaceful regions into war zones, criminal organizations that would use military-grade firepower to enforce their control over communities that couldn't defend themselves. The moment of revelation came when one of the buyers mentioned a specific target for the weapons. He was purchasing a refugee camp that housed families fleeing violence in their home countries. The man spoke about the attack as if he were discussing a business transaction, calculating casualties like profit margins, and discussing tactics with the dispassionate analysis of an accountant reviewing quarterly reports. Sarah felt her finger move toward the trigger of the sniper rifle she'd positioned as backup security, her training taking over as she calculated range, wind speed, and the sequence of shots that would eliminate the three buyers before they could react. It would be simple, a few seconds of precision, shooting that would prevent the weapon sale and save hundreds of innocent lives, but it would also blow her cover, compromise her mission, and potentially start an international incident that could escalate beyond anything she could control. The choice between immediate action and long-term strategic thinking was exactly the kind of decision Colonel Stone's training had prepared her for, but the reality of making it felt nothing like the theoretical exercises she'd practiced. She chose patience, maintaining her observation position, while documenting evidence that could be used to prevent future transactions rather than just this single sale. It was the tactically sound decision, the strategically intelligent choice, and the morally correct action according to her training. It was also a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The transaction concluded without incident. Money changing hands for weapons that would soon change hands, again in markets where human life was valued less than political advantage. Sarah remained hidden until all the vehicles had departed, then spent another hour ensuring that no security personnel had been left behind to monitor the site. Her extraction from the country was handled through channels that she never fully understood, involving false documents that appeared overnight and transportation arrangements that left no paper trail. Within 48 hours, she was back at the Montana facility, sitting across from Colonel Stone in a debriefing room that felt both familiar and alien after her weeks undercover. "Outstanding work, Chun," Stone began, reviewing her mission reports. With the same methodical attention he applied to everything. "The intelligence you gathered will allow us to disrupt Kozlov's network at multiple levels. Several planned attacks have already been prevented based on your documentation of buyer identities and intended targets." Sarah felt a moment of satisfaction at the news, but it was tempered by questions about the methods that would be used to disrupt the network and prevent the attacks. "What happens to Anya, sir? She risked everything to provide information, and she's still in a dangerous position. Ms. Petrov will be extracted within the week and provided with new identity documentation that will allow her to relocate safely," Stone replied. "Her cooperation has been noted at the highest levels, and she'd be well compensated for the risks she accepted." It was the answer Sarah had hoped for, but something in Stone's tone suggested there were aspects of Anya's future that he wasn't sharing. She filed the observation away along with all the other inconsistencies and half-truths that seemed to surround every aspect of her new career. "I have to ask, sir," Sarah continued, "about the weapons that were sold during the transaction I observed. Will there be efforts to intercept them before they reach their intended targets?" Stone's expression became carefully neutral, and Sarah recognized the look from her own training in compartmentalized information sharing. "Some operational details are beyond your clearance level, Sergeant. What I can tell you is that your intelligence will be used to save lives and protect American interests. The specific methods for accomplishing those objectives are determined by people with access to information sources and policy considerations that you're not cleared to know about. It was a dismissal disguised as an explanation, and Sarah understood. That pushing for more details would be both futile and potentially career-ending. But the experience had taught her something important about the world she was entering. A lesson about the distance between tactical success and strategic morality that no amount of training could have prepared her for. Her next assignment came. Within days, before she'd had time to fully process the implications of her first operational deployment. This time the target was domestic, a suspected foreign intelligence operative working within the American defense industry. Someone whose activities potentially threatened ongoing military operations and classified weapons programs. "This is different from your previous mission," Stone explained during the briefing. "You'll be operating on American soil, under American law, with American citizens who have constitutional rights that must be respected. The rules of engagement are more restrictive, but the stakes are just as high." Sarah nodded her understanding, though she was beginning to realize that the rules of engagement in this kind of work were often more theoretical than practical. When national security was at stake, the line between legal and illegal, moral and immoral, necessary and excessive became blurred beyond recognition. But it was during the final moments of her briefing that Stone revealed something that changed her understanding of everything that had come before. "Your father worked this same case 15 years ago," he said quietly, placing a photograph on the table between them. "The target you'll be investigating is someone he identified, but couldn't neutralize due to operational constraints at the time. In a very real sense, you'll be finishing work that he started." The photograph showed a man perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed familiar despite Sarah's certainty that she'd never seen him before. As she studied the image, recognition dawned with the slow horror of watching a car accident unfold. It was Dr. Elizabeth Warren, though the photograph showed her 15 years younger and operating under a different name entirely. Sarah's world shifted on its axis as the implications cascaded through her mind like dominoes falling in precise sequence. The woman who'd been conducting her psychological evaluations, who'd been shaping her mental conditioning for operational deployment, who'd had access to her deepest fears and motivations. That woman was the foreign intelligence operative her father had been trying to expose before his death. "Sir," Sarah's voice was steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest, "Dr. Warren has been conducting psychological evaluations on all the trainees. She's had access to classified program details, personnel files, operational procedures." "No," Stone interrupted, and his tone carried a weight that suggested layers of complexity Sarah was only beginning to understand. "We've known for quite some time." The briefing room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in as Sarah realized that nothing about her recruitment, training, or operational deployment had been what it seemed. "You used me as bait." "We used you as an intelligence asset," Stone corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless to Sarah in that moment. "Your father's investigation 15 years ago established Dr. Warren's true identity and general objectives, but we needed current intelligence about her specific activities and communication methods. Having her personally evaluate the daughter of the man who'd identified her created an irresistible intelligence-gathering opportunity." Sarah felt betrayed in ways she didn't have words for. Every session with Warren, every psychological probe, every moment of vulnerability she'd shared during her evaluation, all of it had been orchestrated as part of an operation that had treated her not as a valued soldier, but as an unknowing pawn. "What about my training, my missions? Was any of it real?" "All of it was real," Stone assured her, but his words felt hollow in light of what she was learning. "You are genuinely qualified for the work we do here, and your operational skills are exactly what we said they were. But your recruitment wasn't random, and your assignments weren't chosen arbitrarily. Everything was designed to create the psychological profile that would make you most effective for this specific mission." The mission itself, as Stone outlined it, was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Dr. Warren, whose real name was Katerina Volkov, had spent 20 years infiltrating American intelligence operations, gathering information about classified programs and feeding strategic intelligence to foreign adversaries. Her position within the psychological evaluation system gave her access to some of the military's most sensitive assets, allowing her to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited for recruitment or elimination. The damage assessment is still ongoing, Stone continued, but preliminary estimates suggest that her intelligence sharing has compromised dozens of operations and potentially hundreds of personnel. Your father died trying to expose her activities, and now it falls to you to complete his work. Sarah stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the professional woman who'd helped her understand her own psychological responses with the image of a foreign spy who'd been manipulating American soldiers for decades. How do you want me to proceed? The plan they outlined was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Sarah would continue her psychological sessions with Warren, but now she would be the one gathering intelligence rather than providing it. Using techniques Warren herself had taught her about deception and manipulation, Sarah would feed false information about her psychological state while documenting Warren's intelligence-gathering methods and communication procedures. The ultimate objective, Stone explained, is to identify her entire network handlers, assets, communication methods, and intelligence priorities. Once we have complete mapping of her operation, we can decide how best to neutralize the threat she represents. The word neutralize hung in the air between them, laden with implications that Sarah understood but didn't want to acknowledge. This wasn't a mission that would end with arrests and trials. Warren knew too much, had been operational too long, and represented too significant a security risk for conventional law enforcement solutions. Her next session with Warren took place 3 days later, and Sarah found herself sitting across from the woman who'd helped kill her father while maintaining the facade of professional cooperation. Warren's office was the same comfortable chairs, soft lighting, the kind of environment designed to encourage openness and trust. But now Sarah saw it through different eyes, recognizing the recording equipment hidden behind picture frames, the subtle psychological manipulation techniques built into the room's very design. "You seem more relaxed than usual," Warren observed, her pen poised over the same legal pad she'd been using since their first session. "The overseas assignment appears to have agreed with you." Sarah had prepared for this moment, practicing responses that would seem natural while concealing her new understanding of Warren's true identity. "It felt good to use my training for something real. The exercises here are valuable, but actually, being operational, it changes your perspective." "In what ways?" "I understand now why my father chose this kind of work," Sarah replied, letting genuine emotion color her voice even as she fed carefully constructed information to her handler. "There's a clarity that comes from serving something larger than yourself, even when the work requires moral compromises." Warren made notes with mechanical precision, but Sarah caught subtle changes in her body language that suggested heightened interest. "What kind of moral compromises?" This was the hook that Stone's people had prepared, bait designed to draw Warren into revealing her intelligence priorities. "I had opportunities to prevent immediate harm, to take direct action against people who were clearly enemies. But my orders were to gather intelligence instead of eliminating threats. It was difficult to watch bad people continue their work when I could have stopped them." "And how did that make you feel about your superiors? About the people giving those orders?" Sarah let herself appear to struggle with the question, as if Warren's probing 3 years after Anya's funeral. Sarah sat in a coffee shop in Prague, watching snow fall on cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of espionage and betrayal. Her appearance had changed again, different hair color, different posture, different accent when she spoke to the barista in flawless Czech. But the eyes remained the same, storm gray and watchful, scanning the crowd with automatic precision, even during moments of apparent relaxation. Her target was a Syrian chemical weapons specialist who'd been selling his expertise to the highest bidder, knowledge that could turn terrorist ambitions into civilian catastrophes. The mission was routine by her current standard: surveillance, intelligence gathering, then elimination if diplomatic solutions proved ineffective. But this morning's intelligence briefing had included a detail that made the assignment personal in ways she hadn't expected. Dr. Yusuf al-Mahmoud had been one of Viktor Kozlov's clients. The connection should have been historical. A footnote in files that documented an arms dealer's network. But al-Mahmoud had continued his work after Kozlov's operation was shut down, finding new suppliers and new buyers for weapons that existed in the gray areas between conventional arms and weapons of mass destruction. According to the intelligence Sarah had reviewed, he was currently negotiating a sale that would provide terrorist organizations with chemical weapons capable of killing thousands. More disturbing was the revelation that his current supplier was someone Sarah recognized from her time undercover, one of the men who'd met with Kozlov during the transaction she'd observed from her hiding place in the abandoned collective farm. The same man who'd casually discussed attacking refugee camps had somehow avoided the network shutdown and continued operating with new partners and expanded capabilities. Some doors, once opened, never close, she murmured, remembering Sergeant Rodriguez's warning from a lifetime ago, when her biggest concern was cleaning weapons that other people would use. Her surveillance of al-Mahmoud revealed a man who'd learned to live with the consequences of his choices in ways that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of herself. He maintained a modest apartment, ate at the same restaurants, followed routines that suggested someone who'd found peace with work that most people would consider monstrous. But she also observed security precautions that indicated awareness of the many people who wanted him dead. The elimination itself was conducted with precision that would have made Colonel Stone proud. A single shot from a rooftop position 800 meters away, fired during the brief moment when al-Mahmoud emerged from his apartment building to enter a waiting taxi. The bullet's impact was immediate and final, preventing a chemical weapons transaction that would have killed innocents whose names Sarah would never know. But as she disassembled her rifle and prepared to exfiltrate from Prague, Sarah found herself thinking about the larger pattern that al-Mahmoud's death represented. She'd been operational for 5 years now, and every successful mission seemed to reveal 2 new threats that required similar solutions. It was like cutting heads off a hydra, tactically successful, but strategically endless. Her extraction route took her through Vienna, where she had 6 hours between flights to visit a location she'd been avoiding for months. The address led her to a small apartment building in a quiet residential neighborhood, where she climbed 3 flights of stairs to stand before a door bearing the name Petrov. Anya's brother answered her knock with the same cautious watchfulness that characterized everyone in their profession. He was perhaps 40, with graying hair and eyes that 15 years after her retirement, Sarah received an encrypted message that would be her final operational communication. It came through channels so secure that only 3 people in the world knew how to access them, and it contained just 4 words. "The circle closes today." She knew immediately what it meant. The arms-dealing network that had killed Anya, that had spawned from Viktor Kozlov's operation, that had evolved through decades of technological advancement and operational adaptation, it was finally being eliminated. Not by a single operation or dramatic confrontation, but by the systematic application of everything she'd helped develop over 30 years of service. Her former students, now senior operators themselves, had spent 2 years infiltrating the network through methods that combine traditional human intelligence with artificial intelligence analysis. They'd identified financial flows through blockchain, tracking that revealed connections invisible to conventional investigation. They'd recruited assets through social media manipulation, so sophisticated that the targets never realized they were being developed for intelligence gathering. Most importantly, they'd maintained the ethical frameworks Sarah had helped design, ensuring that every operation served legitimate security interests rather than institutional convenience. The network's elimination would prevent weapons transfers that could have armed regional conflicts for decades, but it was conducted with surgical precision that minimized collateral damage and preserved the dignity of everyone involved. The final message in Sarah's encrypted communication contained operational details she didn't need to know, but also something more personal. Your teaching saved more lives than we can count. The silence has been broken appropriately. Sarah smiled as she deleted the message, knowing it was the last time she would receive operational intelligence. Her secure phone would remain active for security purposes, but her active contribution to the work was complete. She had trained. The trainers developed the programs and passed along the wisdom that would guide American intelligence operations for the next generation. That evening, she sat on her porch watching the Colorado sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold, and read. Somewhere in the world, young officers were conducting operations that would never be acknowledged, protecting people who would never know they needed protection, serving something greater than themselves while accepting sacrifices that couldn't be explained to anyone who hadn't made similar choices. The work continued. The threats evolved. The mission remained constant. Sarah Chen had started her career cleaning weapons in a maintenance bay at Fort Carson. She was ending it knowing that the world was safer because she had learned to use those weapons in service of something larger than herself. It wasn't a perfect world, it never would be, but it was a world where ordinary people could live ordinary lives without understanding the extraordinary dangers they faced daily. The silence could still be broken when necessary. But more importantly, it was now maintained by people who understood why it existed and what it protected.